When I first saw the letter Marilyn wrote 3 days before her death, my hands were trembling. That letter revealed the truth she hid behind the smile she showed the world. Everyone thought they knew her, but nobody knew what she wrote that night, sitting alone in her Brentwood home. It was the night of August 4th, 1962, one of those hot Los Angeles summer evenings, and Marilyn sat in her living room armchair, wearing her white silk robe. On the table lay a half-empty champagne glass and papers filled with her handwriting. Among those papers was a letter she would never send. Before we continue with this incredible story about Hollywood's most misunderstood icon, hit that subscribe button for more untold celebrity secrets that changed everything. Marilyn looked so tired that night. The last few months had been the hardest of her life. Fox Studio had fired her from Something's Gotta Give. The newspapers wrote new scandals about her every day. But what hurt most was that her phone no longer rang, especially that one phone that no longer rang. Everyone close to Marilyn during that time sensed something was terribly wrong. Her makeup artist knew it. Her driver knew it. Even her housekeeper had noticed that different look in her eyes. But nobody talked about it. In Hollywood, there were certain secrets better left unknown. As Marilyn wrote the letter, she would pause occasionally, as if the words got stuck in her throat. She couldn't continue. Then she'd take a deep breath and start writing again. That letter didn't just speak of love. It contained the price Norma Jean paid to become Marilyn Monroe. Years of roles the studio bosses forced upon her. The surgeries they made her undergo. The chemicals they used to bleach her hair blonde. Everything was in that letter. But the most painful lines were about the man she loved no longer calling her. Marilyn wrote that she would give everything just to hear the president's voice one more time. The neighbor who saw Marilyn that night said she was walking barefoot in the garden. Her white robe gleamed in the moonlight, but her face remained in shadow. The cigarette in her hand was shaking. It was as if storms raged inside her. Yet from the outside, she appeared to be just Hollywood's most beautiful woman. When Marilyn went back inside, she looked at the phone, still silent. Then she returned to the letter and continued writing. In those lines, she spoke of a little girl's dreams. She wrote that Norma Jean only wanted to be loved, but Marilyn Monroe was desired by everyone. The difference between the two was destroying her. She remembered her last days at the studio. The producers yelled at her. The director waited for her on set, but she was crying in her trailer. She couldn't be Marilyn Monroe anymore. That mask was too heavy, and she had no strength left to carry it. But she couldn't tell anyone, because everyone expected her to be Marilyn. In the letter, she also mentioned the birthday song at Madison Square Garden. Everyone remembered that night. Marilyn's entrance in that tight, glittering dress. The breathless way she sang "Happy Birthday, Mr. President." But nobody knew that after that night, the president never called her again. Marilyn wrote that everything changed that night. Bobby Kennedy had warned her. The calls had to stop. There couldn't be a scandal. But for Marilyn, this wasn't just about scandal. This was her heart breaking. She had been used and discarded again. Again, she was just a beautiful toy. But what really happened in those final days was something even darker than anyone imagined. In that letter, she also spoke of her childhood, the days in the orphanage, the nightmare of living in foster homes. Little Norma Jean had nobody. Now Marilyn Monroe had everyone, yet still had nobody. She described this ironic situation in her letter. "I have millions of fans, but my phone doesn't ring." As the night wore on, Marilyn's handwriting became increasingly erratic. It seemed her hands were trembling, or perhaps the medication she'd taken was starting to take effect. Doctors gave her pills to sleep, other pills to wake up. She couldn't even remember which to take when anymore. The studio system had been crushing her for years, but that final summer was different. After Fox fired her, the whispers grew louder. They said she was difficult, unreliable, finished. But those who truly knew her understood the truth. Marilyn wasn't difficult. She was drowning. The very people who created Marilyn Monroe were now destroying her because she could no longer maintain the illusion they demanded. I remember hearing from someone who worked closely with her during those days. They told me Marilyn would arrive at the studio hours late. Not from arrogance, but from fear. She'd sit in her car outside the gates, trying to summon the courage to transform into the bombshell everyone expected. Some mornings she simply couldn't do it. The weight of being Marilyn Monroe had become unbearable. That particular evening, as she wrote her letter, Marilyn recalled a conversation from just weeks earlier. A powerful man in Hollywood had told her bluntly that at 36, she was becoming too old for the roles that made her famous. He suggested she consider other arrangements to maintain her career. The implication was clear, and it wasn't the first time she'd heard such proposals. But this time, something inside her had finally broken. Quick reminder to subscribe for more shocking revelations about Hollywood's golden age that were never meant to be told. The letter revealed her devastating realization that she had been performing her entire life. Even as a child, she learned to smile and be charming to avoid being sent back to the orphanage. She performed for foster families, for studio executives, for the camera, for her lovers. But she had never simply been allowed to be Norma Jean. That girl had been buried so deep under Marilyn Monroe that even she couldn't find her anymore. She wrote about the pills with particular anguish, how they started as helpers, just something to calm her nerves before a scene, something to help her sleep after a long day. But now, they had become her prison guards, keeping her trapped in a fog where she could neither fully sleep nor fully wake. The doctors kept prescribing more, different combinations, stronger doses. They said it was for her own good, but she knew better. They needed her functional enough to work, but sedated enough not to resist. In one particularly heartbreaking passage, she described looking in the mirror that morning and not recognizing the woman staring back. The peroxide had damaged her hair so badly it felt like straw. The surgeries had altered her face in subtle ways that made her feel like a stranger to herself. She was neither Norma Jean nor truly Marilyn anymore. She existed in some terrible space between the two. But the most shocking revelation in the letter was about her final phone call with him. The president had called her 2 weeks before, but not for the reason she hoped. He was ending it, cleanly and coldly, like a business transaction being terminated. She begged him to reconsider, reminded him of promises made in intimate moments, but his voice remained distant, already belonging to another world where she could never follow. That's when she understood the brutal truth about her life. She had been collecting powerful men like others collected jewels, hoping one of them would finally make her feel valuable. But each relationship ended the same way, with her being discarded once she was no longer useful, or when she became too dangerous to keep around. When she finished the letter, it was 3 in the morning. Marilyn placed it in an envelope, but didn't write an address. She knew who it was for, but she didn't have the courage to address it. Perhaps, deep down, she knew this letter would never be sent. She put the letter in the desk drawer. Then she went to her bedroom. She looked at the medicine bottles on the nightstand. The sleeping pills her doctor had prescribed were there. The ones she took every night, but which no longer worked. The next day, August 5th, Dr. Ralph Greenson, one of the last people to see Marilyn alive, said she looked terrible. Marilyn told him she couldn't take it anymore, that she was tired of this life. The doctor tried to calm her, but there was something different in Marilyn's eyes, as if she was saying goodbye. What Dr. Greenson didn't know was that Marilyn had made a decision. The letter in her drawer contained more than just words of heartbreak. It contained a map of every person who had used her, every promise that had been broken, every dream that had been crushed. She named names, cited dates, revealed conversations that would have destroyed careers, and toppled powerful men from their pedestals. But here's what nobody knew until decades later. That letter wasn't the only thing Marilyn wrote that night. There was something else, something that would change everything we thought we knew about her final hours. Hidden in her bedroom, tucked inside a book of poetry she kept by her bedside, was a second note. This one was different. It wasn't addressed to the president or any of her famous lovers. It was addressed to someone nobody would have expected. The housekeeper, Eunice Murray, would later change her story multiple times about that night. First, she said Marilyn's door was locked. Then she said it wasn't. She claimed she saw a light under the door at midnight, but then said it was 3:25 a.m. These inconsistencies weren't mistakes. They were deliberate, because Eunice Murray knew about the second note, and she knew who had visited Marilyn that final night. The visitor arrived just after midnight. Marilyn was still awake, sitting in her bedroom with the phone in her lap, hoping against hope for one last call that would never come. When she heard the knock at her door, she thought perhaps her prayers had been answered. But the person standing there wasn't who she expected. It was someone from her past, someone who knew Norma Jean before she became Marilyn. This person had been watching from the shadows for years, waiting for the right moment. They talked for hours that night, and what was said between them would have shocked the world, because this visitor knew secrets about Marilyn that even she had forgotten, memories that had been buried under years of pills and performance. The conversation they had revealed the darkest truth of all. Marilyn Monroe hadn't just been created by Hollywood. She had been designed from the very beginning. Her transformation from Norma Jean wasn't accidental or organic. It was orchestrated by people with very specific intentions, people who saw in that vulnerable orphan girl the perfect candidate for their experiment in creating the ultimate star. These people had been controlling her life from the shadows since she was discovered. Every relationship, every film role, every public appearance had been carefully planned. Even her breakdown was part of their design. Because Marilyn Monroe was never meant to grow old. She was created to be a shooting star, brilliant, beautiful, and brief. The visitor that night had come to tell her the truth. But more than that, they had come with an offer. There was a way out, they said. A way for Norma Jean to finally be free of Marilyn Monroe forever. All she had to do was take the pills they brought with them. They would handle everything else. For more jaw-dropping stories about the hidden truths of Hollywood's biggest stars, make sure you're subscribed. The pills weren't what killed her, though. What killed Marilyn Monroe was the realization that her entire life had been a performance directed by others. Every moment of joy, every feeling of love, every achievement she thought was hers, all of it had been scripted. She wasn't just playing Marilyn Monroe, she had been played her entire life. In her final hours, she made phone calls, not the desperate pleading calls that people reported, but calm, deliberate calls. She was saying goodbye, but more than that, she was leaving clues. Each person she called received a piece of the puzzle, though none of them realized it at the time. It would take decades for anyone to put those pieces together. Peter Lawford, who received one of those final calls, would later say that Marilyn sounded strange, almost peaceful. She told him to say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to the president, and say goodbye to yourself, because you're a nice guy. Everyone interpreted this as a suicide note, but it wasn't. It was a message. Marilyn was telling them she knew everything. The truth is, Marilyn didn't take her own life that night. She didn't have to. The woman known as Marilyn Monroe had been dying for years, slowly suffocated by the image that had been created for her. That night, August 5, 1962, was simply when Norma Jean finally stopped fighting to keep her alive. When they found her the next morning, she was lying face down on her bed, her hand reaching for the phone. The official story said she had been dead for hours, but the rigor mortis suggested otherwise. The room had been cleaned, items had been removed, and stories had been coordinated before the police were even called. The letter she wrote 3 nights before was gone, along with the second note and any evidence of her midnight visitor. But they didn't find everything, hidden in a place so obvious that nobody thought to look. Marilyn had left one final message. It was discovered years later during renovation of the house, tucked behind a loose tile in her bathroom. Written in lipstick on a small piece of paper were just 4 words: "I never had anyone." Those 4 words contained the entire tragedy of her life. Despite being desired by millions, despite being loved by the most powerful men in America, despite being the most famous woman in the world, Marilyn Monroe died exactly as Norma Jean had lived, completely and utterly alone. The Hollywood machine that created her continued spinning after her death. They turned her tragedy into legend, her pain into poetry, her death into mythology. Books were written, films were made, and conspiracy theories flourished. Everyone had a theory about how Marilyn Monroe died, but they were all asking the wrong question. The question wasn't how she died. The question was whether she had ever truly lived. In the years that followed, those who were close to her would occasionally speak about that final summer. They all noticed the change in her, the way she would sometimes stop mid-sentence and stare into the distance, as if she could see something others couldn't. Some said it was the pills, others blamed the pressure, but a few suspected the truth. Marilyn had discovered something about herself, about her life, that had shattered whatever remained of her will to continue the charade. The letter she wrote 3 days before her death was never found, at least not officially. But those who claim to have seen it say it contained names, dates, and details that would have rewritten Hollywood history. It allegedly revealed not just her affairs with powerful men, but the systematic abuse and manipulation she endured from the very beginning of her career. It named the doctors who kept her drugged, the executives who passed her around like property, and the government officials who used her for their own purposes. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of the letter was its ending. After pages of revelations and accusations, Marilyn had written a single line that captured the essence of her tragedy. "All I ever wanted was to be loved for who I really was, but I never found out who that was supposed to be." Decades later, an elderly woman who had worked as a secretary at Fox during Marilyn's final days made a startling confession. She claimed that on August 3rd, the day before Marilyn wrote her letter, she had overheard a conversation between two studio executives. They were discussing what they called the Monroe problem and mentioned that it would resolve itself soon enough. When she asked what they meant, they simply smiled and said, "Some stars are meant to burn out." This revelation added another layer to the mystery. Had Marilyn's death been orchestrated, or had she simply been driven to it by those who profited from her image, but cared nothing for her soul? The truth, like so much about Marilyn's life, remains hidden behind the glamorous facade that Hollywood created. What we do know is that in her final days, Marilyn Monroe was fighting a battle she couldn't win. She was fighting against an image that had consumed her, against a system that had used her, and against the terrible realization that she had lost herself so completely that there was no way back to who she once was. The pills by her bedside that night weren't just medication. They were the tools of her captivity, keeping her functional enough to perform, but never clear enough to escape. The empty bottles found near her body told the story of a woman who had been medicated into submission for so long that she no longer knew where the performance ended and the real person began. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, would later express deep regret about her treatment. He admitted that the medical establishment had failed her, that they had treated the symptoms of her distress, the anxiety, the insomnia, the depression, without ever addressing the cause. They had kept Marilyn Monroe alive while slowly killing Norma Jean. But even more shocking were the records discovered in a private archive decades later. These documents suggested that Marilyn's treatment was part of a larger experiment in controlling and manipulating public figures through psychiatric drugs. She wasn't the only star subjected to this treatment, but she was perhaps the most famous casualty of a system that viewed human beings as products to be managed rather than people to be helped. The visitor who came to her house that final night has never been identified. Some believe it was a government agent sent to silence her before she could reveal what she knew. Others think it was someone from her past, perhaps someone who knew Norma Jean before fame transformed her. But there's another theory, one that's both more simple and more tragic. What if the visitor was no one at all? What if, in her final hours, heavily medicated and desperately alone, Marilyn imagined one last conversation with someone who understood her? What if she spent her last night talking to the only person who had ever truly known her? Herself. This theory is supported by the housekeeper's contradictory statements. Perhaps she was confused not because she was lying, but because she heard Marilyn talking and assumed someone was with her. In her altered state, Marilyn might have been having a conversation with Norma Jean, finally acknowledging the girl she had buried so deep inside. The tragedy of Marilyn Monroe wasn't just that she died young. It was that she lived her entire adult life as someone else's creation. From the moment she was discovered, she was molded, shaped, and polished into an image that sold movies and magazines but destroyed the woman behind it. Every blonde hair, every breathy word, every swaying walk was a bar in the prison that held Norma Jean captive. Those who knew her in those final days speak of moments when the mask would slip. Her photographer, George Barris, recalled that during their last photo session, there were brief instances when he saw not Marilyn Monroe, but a tired, frightened woman who looked much older than her 36 years. In those moments, he said, her eyes held a sadness so profound it made him want to stop shooting and simply hold her. But he didn't. Nobody did. Because everyone around Marilyn Monroe needed her to keep being Marilyn Monroe. The studio needed their star. The public needed their goddess. And the powerful men in her life needed their beautiful secret. Nobody needed Norma Jean, and so she remained buried, suffocating under the weight of an image that had taken on a life of its own. The letter she wrote 3 days before her death, whether it was destroyed or hidden away in some classified file, contained the truth she was never allowed to speak in life. It was her final attempt to be heard, to be seen, to be known as something more than the blonde bombshell that everyone wanted her to be. But the real tragedy is that even if that letter had been found and published, would anyone have believed it? Or would the world have dismissed it as the ravings of a troubled star, another casualty of fame who couldn't handle the pressure? The system that created Marilyn Monroe was too powerful, too entrenched, to be brought down by one woman's truth, no matter how devastating that truth might be. In the end, Marilyn Monroe's death became just another piece of Hollywood mythology. Her pain transformed into entertainment, her tragedy into a cautionary tale told and retold until the real woman behind it all was completely obscured. The little girl who just wanted to be loved disappeared forever, buried under the legend of the woman she was forced to become. The house in Brentwood where she died still stands, though it's been renovated many times over the years. But locals say that on quiet nights, especially in August, you can sometimes hear something that sounds like crying coming from the bedroom where she was found. Whether it's the wind through the trees or something more, nobody can say for certain. But those who have heard it describe it the same way. It doesn't sound like the breathy voice of Marilyn Monroe. It sounds like a young girl, lost and afraid, still searching for someone to love her for who she really was. Years after her death, a letter surfaced in an auction house, authenticated as being in Marilyn's handwriting. It wasn't the letter from 3 days before her death, but something else, perhaps written weeks or even months earlier. In it, she had written, "I'm so tired of being Marilyn Monroe. Sometimes I wish I could just walk into the ocean and let her float away, and then maybe Norma Jean could walk back out." Those words, more than any conspiracy theory or secret document, capture the essential tragedy of her life. She wasn't killed by pills, or by shadowy figures, or even by Hollywood. She was killed by the slow, relentless erosion of her true self, until there was nothing left but an empty shell performing an endless show for an audience that would never be satisfied. The letter she wrote 3 days before her death may never be found. The truth about her final hours may never be fully known. But what we do know is enough to understand that the death of Marilyn Monroe was not a singular event that occurred on August 5, 1962. It was a slow execution that began the moment Norma Jean was convinced to bleach her hair and change her name, and ended when she finally ran out of strength to maintain the illusion. In her final phone call to Peter Lawford, Marilyn said something that everyone missed at the time. She said, "Tell them I'm finally going to be free." Everyone assumed she meant free through death, but maybe she meant something else. Maybe she meant that in those final moments, she was finally going to stop being Marilyn Monroe. Maybe, for the first time in decades, she was going to allow Norma Jean to exist, even if only for a few hours. The official cause of death was listed as probable suicide, a barbiturate overdose. But those who truly understood what happened to Marilyn Monroe know that the real cause of death was something far more complex. She died of a broken identity, a shattered sense of self, and the unbearable weight of being forced to live as someone else's creation. The pills were just the method. The cause was a lifetime of being denied the right to be herself. As the sun rose on August 5, 1962, the world woke up to the news that Marilyn Monroe was dead. The headlines screamed the loss of a sex symbol, a movie star, a Hollywood legend. But nobody mourned the death of Norma Jean Baker, the girl who had disappeared long before Marilyn Monroe took her final breath. And that, perhaps, is the greatest tragedy of all. Even in death, she couldn't escape the image that had consumed her life. Even now, decades later, when we speak of her, we speak of Marilyn Monroe, Norma Jean remains forgotten, a ghost haunting the edges of a legend she never wanted to become. The letter she wrote 3 days before her death, if it exists, sits somewhere in darkness, holding truths that would shatter the carefully constructed myth of Marilyn Monroe. But maybe that's where it belongs, because some truths are too painful to face, and some tragedies are too profound to fully comprehend. What we can understand is this: a young girl named Norma Jean wanted nothing more than to be loved. Instead, she was transformed into Marilyn Monroe, desired by millions but loved by none. And in the early hours of August 5th, 1962, that transformation finally reached its inevitable conclusion. The last words she ever spoke, according to those who claim to know, weren't the famous goodbye to Peter Lawford. They were much simpler, much sadder. Looking at her own reflection in the darkened window of her bedroom, she whispered, "I don't know who you are anymore." And then, finally, mercifully, the performance ended. The world mourned Marilyn Monroe, but somewhere in the silence that followed, perhaps Norma Jean finally found the peace that had eluded her for so long, not in death, but in the end of the endless act she had been forced to perform. The curtain fell, the lights dimmed, and at last she could stop being someone she never wanted to be. The letter from 3 days before her death remains missing, its secrets buried with the woman who wrote it. But its message, even unseen, resonates through the decades, behind every glamorous image, behind every perfect smile, behind every performance that the world applauds. There might be someone desperately trying to be seen for who they really are. Marilyn Monroe died at 36, but Norma Jean had been gone much longer. And in the end, that's the story that matters. Not how she died, but how she was never truly allowed to live.